Hi, I'm Leslie Anderson, President and CEO of the New Jersey Redevelopment Authority. I am excited to join you for our panel, Strategies for Building Wealth in New Jersey's Distressed Communities, at the 2021 Governor's Housing Conference. There's just a co-panelist this time, folks, and I'm excited to be with my co-panelists, the amazing Otis Rowley. Now, let's talk a little bit about him. He is a valued member at the Rockefeller Foundation, serving as Senior Vice President of the U.S. Equity and Economic Opportunity Initiative. Through this initiative and serving as a change agent, Otis leads the foundation's 2030 sustainability development goal of decent work and economic growth. Otis is a policy redefiner. He is directing all of the US work focused on enhancing the ability of every working person to meet the basic financial needs of their family and have a path towards a better future. Otis is shaking things up, guys, and he shifts the status quo. He has stewardship for US grant making and investment that is aligned to strategic levers to fill key US economic opportunity gaps in tax and budget, policy design, and implementation. He provides access to capital, asset ownership, worker coalition building, and advocacy. Otis is a true urbanist. His career is a reflection of his dedicated work to advancing equity, economic, and community development, primarily in cities, and leading organizations in the for-profit, public, and nonprofit sectors. His 20 years of experience also includes serving in leadership roles to shift change. He is not new to New Jersey, and he's also another place that I call dear to my heart, the state of Maryland, and he's known throughout the world. My friend Otis, it is so great to welcome you to this panel today.
Leslie, thanks so much for the opportunity to join you.
So let's jump in and let's get started. Otis, the pandemic demonstrated for us tremendously the gaps in wealth, particularly in distressed communities. And it was very glaring in a state like New Jersey. What would you say are the greatest impediments to creating and sustaining wealth in distressed communities?
Well, I think before we can talk about the impediments, we really have to define what we're talking about when we say distressed communities. We're talking about people and places that have historically lacked investments, right? We're talking about places that have been underserved for way too long. And those communities typically are communities of color. Black and indigenous people of color usually reside in these low income communities that we call distressed. I think that the reason why I thought it was important for us to talk about what we're defining when we say distress is because I think it's really, really important that we are clear that this did not just happen, right? It's not because of the people that are within that community. It is really because of a lack of investment by policymakers, by the private sector, by the public sector. You know, it took a long amount of time for us not to invest in those areas and for them to become distressed. And so when we talk about the impediments to creating and sustaining wealth in those areas, then we have to understand that past as we try to shape our future. And so I think that future involves both the private and public sector really now paying attention there. When we talk about equity, it is really learning from what you did wrong, learning about the impediments or the barriers to change that existed, and then taking very active and activist steps to counteract that. I think when we look at what has occurred in with COVID-19, that Black and Indigenous people of color had higher rates of infection, higher rates of death, higher rates of unemployment. That was not by happenstance, nor was it because these were communities of color. It was because those communities and those individuals were not invested in prior to COVID-19. And if we're going to build back better, to quote our president, then we have to create a new normal. And that new normal means counteracting what we failed to do in the past by being very intentional in terms of taking those steps that are necessary in terms of public policy and investment in the future.
So Otis, let's take this just one step further and talk about a little bit about what the collective we has done in the past that resulted in the disinvestment in a number of these communities.
Well, I mean, we can take it all the way back in terms of, it starts with enslaved labor, it moves to Jim Crow, it is redlining, it is failure of access to educational opportunity, to employment opportunity. There is a long and sad history in terms of how people of color have been treated within our country, right? And so all of those things help to create the disparities that we have today, right? You cannot take off someone's shoes, throw glass in front of them, and then say, okay, well, let's race, right? Because we're not talking about both of us being at the same place, particularly because you need to recognize that you robbed them of their shoes and you threw glass in front of the path for which they were going to run on. I think when we talk about the future, when we talk about how we're going to build a better reality in New Jersey, in our country, you have to really take into consideration what was done in the past, and be conscious of those things that we can do. If you recognize redlining, then what are those things that we can be doing as it relates to mortgages, in terms of in terms of zoning codes, in terms of because all these things were involved in creating the disparity. And so we need to use those same tools and new tools. We have to be open to innovation and flexible to really try to address what's happened in the past.
I love it. I love it. There's a word that we hear a lot of. It's always been there, but we're hearing it more now than we've heard it in the past. And that word is equity. And I mean, I know what equity means, so I'm not asking you to define equity, but let's put equity into the context of applying justice, and in particular, economic justice that has been out of balance for generations of people that are both indigenous and of color.
Yeah, I think if we're going to achieve economic justice for all, if we're going to be serious about an equity agenda, then we must center Black and Indigenous people of color in underserved communities in our effort to serve them. Right? Think about it. Throughout much of this nation's history, we centered white men, right, in our policy, in our laws, in our employment systems, in terms of who was hired, who was advanced, how loans were distributed, and that's from the both public sector and the private sector. I think if we're serious now about having an equitable agenda, if we're serious about economic justice, then you have to reverse the history of what we've done and really center those communities so that we've really prevented from having access to capital, access to credit, access to opportunity. I think that's, if you're serious about equity, and it's not just lip service, but it's then taking your public policy, your programs, and doing those things to reverse course. I think you are a prime example in terms of some of the things that you've done. I think was really intentional around not going with the status quo, actually operating outside of the norms. And then because of that, really being smart in terms of who you were able to help in the midst of COVID-19, And I think it's an example, it's a model in terms of some of what we can do and should do if we're serious about creating an equitable agenda and and being serious about achieving economic justice.
So if we can, for those that are listening this morning, what I want to do is kind of pause here and put a little more meat on the bone that Otis just kind of tossed out to you guys. In the midst of the pandemic, the Redevelopment Authority created the Small Business Lease Emergency Assistance Grant Program. And we launched that program in August. I think we got approval in July of 2020, and it launched in August. And what we knew in that short period of time from shutdown in March to when the program was approved in July, that a number of businesses in the communities that are considered NJRA eligible communities, which are, and I don't want to say urban because I don't want to equate urban to distressed, but these are communities that lack access to capital, historically have lacked investment. It is turning around and changing somewhat, but it's not necessarily hitting all aspects of those communities. So what we knew and what we were learning was that none of the businesses that we were serving through our small business lease program had access or had received any support in the millions of dollars that were coming out of government by August. They had received absolutely nothing. And this is not designed for people to bristle and take it personally and get offended, but they hadn't received it. And a lot of it was some of the things we're talking about, Otis, is systemically creating practices and policies and unintentional and unconscious obstacles to accessing resources. And we made it easy. We said, show up with your lease, prove that you're there, and we'll pay your rent. Right. And you also had to be registered with the state. And so that's what led to 90% of our businesses being minority owned businesses, because they said, hey, I can do that because I have a lease, I'm registered with the state, and I'm a viable business and I exist. And I think that as we shift and move and we called it a new normal, that's what we're calling it. We have to look at the way we're doing business, at the way we're meeting the needs of the community, and just talk to me a little bit about how the Rockefeller Foundation in this new normal is changing the way they do business to increase their impact. Because let's be clear, the Rockefeller Foundation is impactful. We're not going to say that it's not, but it is. But I think with you in the position that you're in, you're leading a charge to increase and elevate that impact.
Well, Leslie, I think the answer can be found in actually modeling some of what you did, right? Ultimately, the reason why you were successful is because you centered those who needed the resources the most. This wasn't about feeding the beast. It wasn't about what's in the best interest of the bureaucratic infrastructure, right? It was how do we meet them where they are, right? And how do we get them what they need, right? So you centered their needs above your own. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at the Rockefeller Foundation. I'm lucky enough to work with a large, well-known foundation. It's a global foundation. We're 108 years old, right? And so sometimes we act like that, right? And that's no way to be ageist in any way, right? But we can kind of be set in our ways, right? And so what we've tried to do is to really be to center our grantees. Right? BIPOC-led organizations often share the experiences of the community they serve, right? So I want them to feel the power. I want them to exercise their power. It's not about me empowering them. They already have power, right? It's acknowledging that power, acknowledging their sphere of influence, acknowledging their networks, right? And treating them as true partners. And then encouraging others to do so, right? So being intentional about how we dedicate our dollars, increasing the number of Black and Latinx led grantees and organizations is really trying to set an example for other grant makers, right? And also to set examples for other departments within our foundation to really advance an equity agenda. It is centering those who have historically not been centered. That's a true a true effort towards equity, but whether it's in philanthropy or the public sector or quasi-public, if we're serious about an equitable agenda, that's what you have to do. And that's what we're trying to do at the Rockefeller Foundation.
And I agree, Otis. One of the things that I want to talk just a little bit about is that um, that the community that doesn't get a seat in the room, right? You and I are sometimes making a lot of these decisions, and we're bringing something to the table that I think does not have a tangible value, but it has an intangible value to it, and it's called perspective.
Mm.
And as we look at strategies to build wealth, I have friends and colleagues that come from all walks and backgrounds, and perspective is important, right? And it's not necessarily the glass half full or the glass half empty perspective, but it's your experiences that you bring to the table in a professional setting to shape policy. So how do your perspectives, or how do you begin to value perspective so that those individuals that it's difficult to give them a seat at the table when those funding decisions are being made, right? We do a great job of and I don't want to minimize it, but we do a great job of the focus groups and the listening. But when it comes time to make the decision, and sometimes you're presented with an opportunity and you don't have time to do that, talk a little bit about the value of different perspectives in the room.
Um, it's I read something recently. This a sister on Twitter said it is basically not up to us to give to be a voice for the voiceless, right? It's arrogance to think you can provide the voice for the voiceless. If we're smart about this, we recognize that ultimately they're not voiceless. They've been systematically silenced, right? And so it is not necessarily up to you and I in our positions of privilege and power to speak for others, right? It is up to us to tear down those systems that don't allow their voice to be heard, right? And so again, and forgive me for keep going back to it, but I love it because it's a model, right? What you did in terms of going straight to those individuals needing to be served is the right path, right? We, as rich as our backgrounds may be, as deep as it may be, the experiential knowledge that you and I may bring to our work, all those things matter, but ultimately we should not necessarily be speaking for those who have been disenfranchised. We need to change the table, right? And add some extra chairs or build a whole new table to make sure that those who have historically been disinvested in and disenfranchised are in a position to advocate for themselves, and that we're in a position to lift them up, right? And to amplify their voices. And I think that's fundamentally what we need to be doing. At the end of the day, I'm at a $6.4 billion foundation, right? So literally, our job is to give money to grantees to do the work, right? So it is not what Otis has done. It's not what the Rockefeller Foundation has done, but it's what different grantees are doing to pursue an equitable agenda. You mentioned our vision statement, right? That people should be able to achieve economic security and economic mobility. Anybody, any American family, right, who's working should be able to make ends meet and have a path towards a better future. That's the American promise. That's not a red promise. It's not a blue promise. It's not a rural promise. It's not an urban promise. It's the American promise. And so what are those things that we need to do to advance that promise and to make sure that we're living up to it? And I think the best way we do that is to tear away at those systems that are in place that are preventing that promise from being lived out to its fullest. And I think we can do that if we pay attention to those who have historically been kept out of that promise.
I love it, and I think um, it's a delicate balance that we walk, right, in reality, because not everyone is always willing or able to hear the voice of those that have been silenced. Uh, to be candid, there were some who looked at me like I was crazy and said that you're making this too easy for people to get access to money, right? And understand that in a world where I understand the difference between access to capital to finance projects versus giving a business a grant in resources that we've received as a state. There's an accountability on both sides of it, and we do look at access to capital a lot differently. And I'm being delicate here because sometimes people are comfortable with the system because from their perspective, the system works. And we're meeting enough of a goal that we don't need to push for change that hard because change is going to come. I'm not going to call out your age. I'll call out mine. So my age puts me as a baby in the middle of the civil rights movement, but I had the opportunity to know my great grandparents, and they migrated to New Jersey from Virginia because they wanted to vote. But even in wanting to vote, there were still some systems that they felt would take care of themselves. My mom was a radical, and they were very uncomfortable with her role in the civil rights movement as I was a little girl growing up, because my great grandparents felt that there were certain systems that if they got the right to vote, everything would take care of itself. And we've come to know that that's not the case. So, what are some of the systems we should be looking at, and not me and you, but we as a society that wants to level the playing field of building wealth? What are some of the systems that we need to be looking at right now that won't take care of themselves, that we have to consciously focus on improving and unraveling how it's locked people out for centuries?
It's a great question because there is no one and done, right? It's not just, oh, if we just secure the right to vote, then all of our problems will be solved, or if we just achieve economic stability and economic mobility, all our problems will be solved. I agree with you. There are layers of complexity in terms of what has contributed to the systemic and historic racism that has occurred in the US. And so we need to approach the resolution to that historic racism with the same level of complexity. So I would answer it by saying some of the systems that we need to address are, yes, voting is still important, right? If it was not important, there would not be 48 different state legislatures trying to remove the right to vote and disenfranchise African American and Latinx and immigrant populations right now. So yes, that needs to be dealt with because we need to be able to select our policymakers and our legislators and the members of our executive branches at the local and state and federal level. But, or I should say, and we also need to be focused in and on our educational system. Our public schools are more segregated now than when you and I were growing up. Let me say that again. Our public schools are more segregated now than when you and I were growing up, when there was legal segregation, right? And so that is problematic on so many different levels, right? And if we're serious about giving people the tools that they need, forget about it being from a moral perspective, right? And that there's the moral imperative that it's the right thing to do. If you are you just selfish and want America to win, right? If you want us to be competitive, then we have to stop doing what we've been doing, and we have to make sure that a quality education is being had by everyone, right? That the schools in Newark should be as good as the schools in Princeton, right? And so if we are serious about dealing with the issue of equity, so I would say voting, yes, education, yes, but then also economic systems that are at play, right? Both in terms of the economic power that the public sector can bring to bear and the private sector, right? Access to capital and credit, right? It's been shown over and over again, sadly, that a white person and a Black person, both with the same credit rating and the same pedigree, going to the same schools, the African American will not be able to get those loans that their white counterpart gets, right? We have seen that even when a white individual and a Black individual own the same home, right? That the Black individual pay the Black tax, meaning, right, that their home will be appraised lower, right, and they won't be able to generate the generational wealth that their white counterpart is able to do. And so you have to also, yes, you have to look at our voting system. We have to look at our education system, but we also have to address the elephant in the room, the elephant that you and I deal with, you better than me because you are a strong Delta, but just trying to figure out, right, how do we make sure that the economic system changes, right? That banks and CDFIs are providing access to capital and credit in a way that we have not been doing in the past, right? And so we have to think differently about our underwriting and how we look at loans, how we the decisions that we make about what is risk and who is risky, right? So that it is less subjective and create opportunities for African American, Latinx, for women, all to generate and build up wealth in ways that historically they've not been able to. So those are just three, right? Just voting and education and economic system. There are more, right? But I would say that those three, I think, are crucial as we're talking about the things that need to occur for us to open up the gates of opportunity. I think fundamentally, that if we have access to opportunity, that then will be seriously addressing what has historically kept Black and Brown communities back. Right? It is access to opportunity where we have not had, right? Whether it's the right schools, whether it's the right loans, whether it's access to the right kind of networks. If we open up that access to opportunity, that's when we're going to start removing the disparity and having a true equitable society.
I absolutely love the direction and the conversation, because I think sometimes we can fall back into our normal, right? Offices are reopening, people are commuting back to work, schools are reopening, and we forget the thoughts that we had as we were all sheltered in place and working remotely. So a couple things I want to say. I mean, you know who we are as the Redevelopment Authority.
Yes.
It's our job to go into communities that are primarily urban. We have a few communities. Sussex Borough is now an NJRA eligible community. And it is because some of their economic conditions mirror what you find in urban areas, right? So we also have to shift our thinking that some of what we're experiencing can happen in an urban or in a rural community. And New Jersey provides that because we're such a densely populated state that runs the gamut. I do meet people sometimes and they're like, how are y'all the Garden State? And I say, oh, go to a blueberry bog and you'll figure it out. But um, when we created the Redevelopment Authority, and I get in trouble a lot because I don't necessarily look at the number of units of housing, the number of square feet of commercial or retail space. I'm concerned about the family that gets a house that can call it a home.
Right.
I'm looking at the impact of the project on the neighborhood. And there's another piece that we didn't get a chance to talk about, which is environmental justice. What did the developer use in constructing their building, right? Is it an HVAC system? Did they use bamboo flooring? Did they use a type of paint that doesn't increase a child's risk of access to increasing their asthma? So we've always looked at it like that, and we don't fit neatly into a box. But what I've known in the projects that we've completed is that we improve the quality of life for the people that were able to take advantage of um, of that particular project, whether it was an affordable housing project. And you know, Otis, you and I say this, we all live in affordable housing. We live in what we can afford. Or if it was considered in the housing world, a market rate. And again, it's what the market can stand for where you go. But we're starting to get requests for projects. We're starting to banks are opening back up again, and they want to do underwriting and they want to complete projects. So as we look at this, and I can pick Otis Rowley's brain, give Leslie Anderson some advice on where, and looking at addressing the wealth gap and disparity. Give me some advice and direction and insight on what we should be looking at as we look to structure financing moving into 2022.
Well, obviously, I'm slightly biased, right? So, in that we have a theory of change that we are seriously trying to advance, which guides our work. It invests in organizations and businesses that reflect the communities that they're serving. You said you get in trouble prioritizing people over square footage and numbers of units, but that's what I would call good trouble, right? That's ultimately what we should be doing, right? There are challenges that are still in place that really create barriers to business training and capital at every stage of business development. And so for us, ultimately, we want to really invest in those organizations that are being very intentional, to focus in on those members of the population that have not had access to the capital that they need to be successful. So some of the organizations that we are funding, one of which is called Elevate.
Mhm.
It is run by an Atlanta-based Our Village United. It is a BIPOC-led organization, and they're aimed at empowering Black-owned businesses with the resources, mentorship,
Mhm.
and training, as well as wellness support, right? Because racism can be quite a mental health challenge, right? And so just really also trying to provide true wraparound services for them to be successful. We're funding an organization called 1863 Ventures, right? We're one of their funders, and they're very nationally. They are it's run by Melissa Bradley, a Black woman entrepreneur who understands firsthand the challenges of being pedigreed, being brilliant, and still being faced with all the racism and sexism that will prevent you from starting, sustaining, and growing a business. And so understanding all those barriers, she really tried to set up how to support Black funders and Black
Mhm.
funders and founders who have the opportunity to access grants to really give them the resources that they need to be successful. So when you ask that question in terms of what are some of the things that you can do, it would be number one, to provide access to capital. Don't talk about it, be about it, right? In terms of and making sure that you are providing that capital to those communities that historically did not have access to that capital. And again, that is a policy decision that has to be made to counteract a policy decision that was made to prevent them from having access previously. And I would also say to provide contextualized technical assistance, right, in terms of meeting organizations where they are and knowing what they need to be successful, right? So there was a great op-ed that was written where a number of women entrepreneurs were saying, we don't want another 101 business training class, right? We all have MBAs, we're ready to go, bring the cash and we can move forward, right? And I think, but as you're thinking about some of what is needed, being very, very strategic in terms of understanding the different sectors and providing contextualized technical assistance to help to provide additional resources to those businesses trying to grow and trying to build wealth. So I think those who it's an access to capital and credit that historically they did not have, right? And it's contextualized technical assistance to meet them where they are with the resources they need in the work that they are doing, and not the 101 training, right? Not the 101 resources that you can really kind of take off the shelf and provide to anyone, because they already know those things. They have taken the risk. They understand what is necessary to be an entrepreneur. They need specific assistance around the specific work that they're doing, and knowing that and meeting them where they are. And again, that's what was, I think, really powerful about, and why you had 90% connection, right? Because you met folks where they were. Right. And I think that's what we have to do, meeting folks where they are. But when you meet them there, bring the checkbook.
Listen, I want to say this to you emphatically. You are so on point. And I think that out of this, I hope that you and I can talk to our colleagues in this space to let them know they have to do the same thing.
Yes.
Right? Let's not announce a $200 million program and then the devil is in the details, so difficult that a year from now, when the media is not paying attention, no one of color was able to take advantage of the program because you intentionally wrote it so that they couldn't do it.
Right.
And I think that you and I, and there are others that you and I both know that can begin to in spaces, and the community does not need to be in those rooms, but we need to be in those rooms, side-eyeing folks and saying, you know, you're wrong for that.
Well,
And
there
there has to
was,
be a better way to do it.
I completely agree. There was over $50 billion was committed by foundations and corporations towards advancing racial equity in the middle of COVID-19, in the middle of the racial reckoning, as we dealt with the trauma and the sad and tragic deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Billions and billions of dollars were committed, and only about 250 million of which has been spent. Right. And so, yes, I agree with you. We need to lift that up. We need to call that out. We need to hold each other and others accountable. Right. I can talk about the commitments made by large banks and large corporations, but I also need to look at the man in the mirror, right, and say, okay, well, what has Rockefeller done? Where are we at? I'm proud of our track record, particularly during COVID and the amount of grants that we've moved over the last 2 years. But it doesn't stop once we have 90% vaccination rates, right? Because we can't go back to the old normal, because the old normal was destructive to people of color. The old normal was sexist and advanced patriarchy. We have to think of the new normal that is going to pursue an equitable agenda for all of America, right? Because we're either all going to succeed or we're all going to fail. And I think we got that more and more in the midst of COVID-19, because it helped us, I think, to really peel the layers back. And it exposed our health inequity, it exposed our job inequities. It really showed us where disparity existed. And I think it's really providing us an opportunity to seriously address it. The alarms have gone off and we can't allow them to go back off again.
I want to give you the last word on that, Otis, because the way you said it, the alarms went off, and we have a responsibility and an obligation, and we have to be accountable to making that change, to being there is I have a t-shirt and it says be the change, right? It says, and you can't necessarily walk into a professional setting with a t-shirt on, but I do walk in thinking a lot, and I know that you do, and we have colleagues that do, that want to be the change. And I think the direction and the accountability for those that are listening. And then now I just want to briefly talk to you. For those that are listening, when we talk about calling out, it's coming together. There was something that you said, Otis, that just resonated with me tremendously. You said they're not voiceless, they're silenced.
Mhm. Yes,
And they're silenced, right? And they've either been generationally silenced or intentionally silenced, right? Because we don't want to hear it. And I think as we sit in these seats, for those of you that are listening, this is an audience of the doers. You are the doers, particularly in the state of New Jersey. And we probably had a greater reach with this virtual conference, but we're the doers. And when we have a responsibility, we have an obligation to say, why not? Why can't we do it that way? Why
yeah.
can't we make a difference? And we have to, if I could just take the silence in another way, we have to silence those that want to maintain the status quo. So our obligation, for those of you that are listening, if you want to take away, it's we have to silence the status quo, and we have to stop letting it be the status quo. And we have to make changes. And we have to know that when we announce programs and we go in a room, I've been in those rooms. My career has been in government, where you go in a room and the program is announced, and you start talking about the policy, and you're talking to all government people. I have to give you an example. And I love my staff, and I know they're behind the scenes right now listening to me do this. But we're doing a Mind Your Business podcast series, and we had to interview this great business owner, and he wouldn't commit. Well, we were trying to interview him on Wednesday at 11 o'clock. He's a small business owner. On Wednesday at 11 o'clock, he's running his business.
Right.
So when we switched it to Sunday at 10 o'clock, we had him immediately. He immediately committed to being a part of it. So that small gesture and the impact of that conversation on businesses that will get an opportunity to hear it through a podcast, it seems so small and it seems trivial and it seems unimportant, but it's very important to, as you said earlier, meet people where they are.
Yeah.
And we have achieved, and there are those of you that are on in this workshop listening to this panel, that you've achieved enough to push the brake, to say, stop this Ferris wheel or this roller coaster. We're not getting off, but we're going to change the direction that we're going in. And at the end of a day, let's start a 12-month calendar today, right now, saying that 12 months from now, and Stacy Spirit, don't be mad at me, but this is going to be an accountability for 2022's housing conference, to see what we all did collectively. And Otis, listen, as my grandmother would say, Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll come back together and revisit this conversation in a year to see what we all did. And I can't see you, but I know you're there to say, what did I do? Because once each of us makes the commitment to do something different, it's like lighting a candle in a dark room. It makes all the difference in the world. And there are people counting on us to do just that. Otis,
Right.
I want to thank you so much for being here with me today. I look forward to us having a moment to connect. There's something else that I want to say to you. Congratulations on your induction into the African American Hall of Fame at Rutgers University. I'm excited for you. I
Thank
believe
you.
it's happening on Saturday. Unfortunately, I waited till the last minute to get my ticket and it's sold out, but I'm so proud of all that you've accomplished. I look forward to us working together in the future on great things that will improve the quality of life for people that are counting on us to make that happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And let me just close quoting Alicia Sanchez. Our work is not to be other people's voice. It is to question how and why we got access to spaces others couldn't, and to pass the mic.
Amen. Amen. And sometimes drop it. No, I'm kidding.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Otis. I appreciate you so much.